I was just trying to heal. I didn't expect to fall in love with someone half my age. She told me her husband was gone, that she was alone. I believed her until I saw him buying fruit, smiling, alive. In that moment, I realized I wasn't part of her life. I was a side story. I wasn't looking for love when I walked into that clinic in Quezon City. Hell, I wasn't looking for anything except maybe a prescription for the back pain that had been haunting me since Margaret's funeral. 3 weeks in the Philippines, and I still felt like a ghost drifting through humid streets and unfamiliar faces. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and hope, 2 things I'd grown suspicious of since watching cancer eat my wife alive. "Mr. Shaw?" Her voice cut through my fog like morning light through curtains. I looked up from the plastic chair where I'd been staring at my hands, and there she was, Clarice. Though I didn't know her name yet. All I knew was that she wasn't looking at me with pity. Everyone back in Oregon looked at me with pity. The neighbors, the teachers at my old school, even the grocery store clerk who knew Margaret used to come with me every Saturday for 37 years. Yes, that's me. I stood up, my knees protesting. 67 years of living, and my body was keeping score. "Dr. Santos will see you now. But first let me check your blood pressure." She gestured to a small chair beside her desk. As I sat down, she wrapped the cuff around my arm with practiced gentleness. Her fingers were warm against my wrist. When was the last time someone had touched me without it being medical or obligatory? "You're from America?" she asked, pumping the cuff. Her English was careful, precise, like she'd learned it from textbooks but spoke it with music. "Oregon, retired school principal." I watched her write numbers on my chart. She had this way of concentrating, her eyebrows drawn together just slightly, her lips pressed in a thin line. "What about you? Are you a nurse?" "Midwife," she said, removing the cuff. "I work here part-time. The rest of the week I'm at a women's clinic across town." She looked at me then, really looked at me. Not at my chart or my gray hair or the way my shirt hung loose on my shrinking frame. At me. "What brings you to the Philippines, Mr. Shaw?" I could have lied. Should have lied. Instead, I heard myself saying, "My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer." I needed to be somewhere she'd never been. The words surprised me. I hadn't talked about Margaret to anyone in months. Clarice nodded slowly. No platitudes. No, "I'm sorry for your loss." Just understanding in her dark eyes. "Sometimes we need new places to remember who we are," she said softly. "Exactly." My throat felt tight. Exactly. When Dr. Santos finished with me 20 minutes later, muscle relaxers and physical therapy recommendations, I found myself lingering by Clarice's desk. She was filing papers, humming something under her breath. "Thank you," I said. "Not just for the medical stuff, for understanding." She smiled then, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Would you like to get coffee sometime? I know a quiet place near Tomas Morato." Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who doesn't know your whole story. I should have said no, should have recognized the danger in those kind eyes and that gentle voice. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'd like that very much." As I walked out of that clinic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing kind that kept me awake at night, but quiet hope, the kind that makes you notice the sky again. I had no idea I was about to fall in love with a ghost. My husband died in a motorcycle accident 2 years ago. Clarice stirred her coffee slowly, her eyes fixed on the swirling cream. We were sitting in a small cafe near Tomas Morato, just as she'd promised. The evening air was thick with exhaust and the smell of grilling meat from street vendors. I set down my cup carefully. 2 years ago? The same time my wife? Yes. She looked up at me then, and I saw it. That hollow space behind her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. He was coming home from work. Night shift at a construction site. A truck ran a red light. We sat in silence for a moment. 2 people who understood that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you carry. Like a stone in your chest that shifts but never disappears. "Do you have children?" I asked. "A son. Leo. He's 6 now." Her voice softened. "He doesn't remember much about his father. Sometimes I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse." I thought about Margaret and me, how we'd tried for kids for years before accepting it wasn't meant to be. "It's probably a blessing," I said. "Pain you can't remember can't hurt you. But memories you can't access can't comfort you either. She touched the rim of her coffee cup with her fingertip. What was your wife like? Margaret? I smiled without meaning to. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, made casseroles for sick neighbors even when she was exhausted from her own chemo treatments. She taught kindergarten for 40 years and never lost her faith in human goodness. She sounds beautiful. She was, inside and out. Even at the end, when the cancer had taken everything else, her eyes were still beautiful. I paused. What about your husband? Miguel was intense, passionate about everything. His work, his dreams, his anger. Clarice's fingers tightened around her cup. He wanted to build houses for poor families. Said construction was just temporary until he could start his own company. The accident happened 3 months before he would have gotten his contractor's license. I'm sorry. We both carry ghosts, don't we? She reached across the table and touched my hand. Her skin was warm, alive. But maybe that's why we understand each other. I looked down at her small hand covering mine. Margaret had been gone for 2 years, but I still wore my wedding ring. Clarice wore no ring at all, just a thin scar on her ring finger, barely visible. Would you like to walk? She asked. There's a park nearby. Sometimes I take Leo there to feed the birds. As we walked through the warm evening air, she told me about her work at the women's clinic, about helping deliver babies and holding the hands of scared young mothers. I told her about teaching, about the satisfaction of watching shy children discover they were smarter than they thought. Do you miss it? She asked. Teaching? Sometimes. But I was ready to retire when Margaret got sick. I wanted to spend every minute with her that I could. I stopped walking. That sounds selfish, doesn't it? It sounds like love. We were standing under a streetlight, moths dancing around the yellow glow above us. Clarice looked up at me with those understanding eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could breathe completely. Clarice? Yes. Thank you for this. For talking. For understanding. She stepped closer, and I caught the scent of her shampoo, something floral and clean. Thank you for letting me remember I'm more than just a mother and a midwife. I wanted to kiss her. The urge hit me like a physical ache. Instead, I took her hand and squeezed it gently. She squeezed back. I should get home to Leo, she said finally. Of course. Can I see you again? I'd like that. She smiled. Very much. As I walked back to my rented condo that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Margaret got sick. I felt alive, not just surviving but actually living. It scared me and thrilled me in equal measure. I had no idea how dangerous that feeling could be. Leo, come say hello to Mr. Douglas. Clarice's voice was gentle but firm. Her son peeked around the corner of their small apartment, all dark eyes and serious expression. The place was modest but spotless, a 2-bedroom unit with white walls and careful decorations that spoke of limited funds but unlimited care. Hello, Leo said softly, then disappeared back around the corner. He's shy with strangers, Clarice explained, but something in her tone suggested it was more than that. Would you like some coffee? I'd been visiting for 3 weeks now, and each time felt like stepping into a carefully maintained illusion. Everything was just a little too perfect, a little too clean, a little too rehearsed. But I told myself I was being paranoid. After 2 years of grief, maybe I'd forgotten what normal felt like. Actually, let me help with groceries this week, I said, pulling out my wallet. I noticed you're running low on. Douglas, you don't need to. I want to. Please. I placed 2,000 pesos on her kitchen counter. For Leo's school supplies. For whatever you need. She stared at the money for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Relief? Guilt? It passed too quickly for me to identify. Thank you, she said finally. You're very kind. It's nothing. Back home, I was always helping my students' families when times were tough. It's what you do. That afternoon, while Clarice was at work, I decided to surprise her with dinner. I'd bought ingredients at the local market and planned to cook something simple, pasta and vegetables, nothing fancy. When I knocked on her door at 6 o'clock, there was no answer. I tried again at 7. At 8. Finally, around 9:30, my phone buzzed with a text. So sorry. Had to work overtime. Emergency delivery. Rain check? I stood outside her door holding bags of groceries that were growing heavy in my hands. Through the thin walls I could hear a television playing. Children's cartoons. Leo was inside, but where was the babysitter? Who was watching him while his mother worked these mysterious overtime shifts? 2 days later, I tried to visit again. Unannounced. This time. No answer, but I could hear voices inside. Adult voices. A man's laugh. When I called Clarice, an hour later, she sounded flustered. Douglas, what's wrong? I stopped by around 4. I thought I heard. Oh, that was my cousin. He sometimes helps me with Leo after school. I was having a terrible migraine and couldn't even think straight. Her voice was strained. I'm sorry I didn't answer the door. I looked awful. Her cousin. Right. In 3 weeks of conversation, she'd never mentioned having family in Manila. She'd specifically told me she was alone, that Miguel's family had rejected her after his death, that her own parents had died when she was young. Is everything okay? I asked. Of course, why wouldn't it be? No reason. I was just worried. You don't need to worry about me, Douglas. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. But I did worry. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of the city outside my window and tried to piece together the inconsistencies. The apartment that was too clean for a working single mother. The child who seemed more wary than shy. The cousin who appeared and disappeared like smoke. The way Clarice's eyes sometimes went distant when she thought I wasn't looking. Mrs. Reyes, the elderly woman who lived next door to me, had warned me weeks ago. Be careful, hijo, she'd said one morning as we waited for the elevator together. Filipino women who date foreign men. Some are genuine, but some are very good actresses. She's very beautiful to be alone. I'd brushed off her words as prejudice, as the jealousy of an old woman watching someone younger find happiness. But now, lying in the dark, I wondered if Mrs. Reyes had seen something I'd chosen to ignore. Still, when Clarice called the next morning and asked if I wanted to take Leo to the zoo, I said yes immediately. When she smiled at me over lunch and told me I was the kindest man she'd ever known, I believed her completely. When she let me hold her hand as we walked through the park, I felt like the luckiest man alive. Love, I was learning, could make you willfully blind. Or maybe I wasn't in love at all. Maybe I was just so desperate not to be alone anymore that I'd convinced myself that what we had was real. Either way, I was about to learn the difference between hope and delusion. And that lesson was going to destroy me. I have a work training all day today. Clarice had told me over the phone that Saturday morning. Something about new birthing techniques. Very boring but required. No problem, I'd said. I was thinking of exploring some local markets anyway. Maybe I'll cook for you tomorrow night. That sounds wonderful. I'll call you tonight. So, there I was, at 10 in the morning, wandering through a public market near Cubao, trying to pick out vegetables for a meal I'd never get to cook. The market was chaos, vendors shouting prices, children darting between stalls, the smell of fish and spices and humanity, all mixed together under corrugated metal roofs. I was examining some tomatoes when I heard a laugh I recognized. My blood turned to ice water. I looked up and saw him first. Tall, maybe 35, with the kind of lean build that comes from physical work. He was holding a plastic bag full of apples and grinning at something the vendor had said. Beside him, a small hand tugged at his shirt. Papa, can we get mangoes too? Leo. Leo was calling this man Papa. My hands went numb. The tomatoes I'd been holding fell to the ground, rolling across the dirty concrete, but I didn't notice. I couldn't notice anything except the impossible scene unfolding 20 feet away from me. Because there she was. Clarice. Not in her work uniform, not rushing off to some training seminar, but wearing a simple yellow sundress and flip-flops, looking relaxed and happy in a way I'd never seen her look with me. She was comparing prices on mangoes, her head tilted the way it did when she was concentrating, and when Miguel, because who else could it be, leaned over and whispered something in her ear, she laughed and bumped his shoulder with hers, like a wife. Like a woman in love with her husband on a Saturday morning trip to the market. I stood frozen between stalls of vegetables and raw fish, watching the family I thought I'd been invited to join. Leo swung between them, holding both their hands, his feet barely touching the ground as they lifted him over puddles. The man ruffled his son's hair and said something that made the boy giggle. This wasn't a dead husband. This wasn't a widow struggling alone. This was a family doing what families do on weekend mornings, buying groceries and enjoying each other's company while some fool back in Oregon thought he was saving them. I wanted to march over there. I wanted to grab Clarice by the shoulders and demand an explanation. I wanted to scream that I'd been sending her money, that I'd been planning a future, that I'd been falling in love with a woman who'd been lying to me from the very first day we met. Instead, I turned around and walked away like a coward. My legs felt disconnected from my body. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble hailing a taxi. When I finally made it back to my condo, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for 3 hours, trying to process what I'd seen. The man wasn't dead. Miguel wasn't dead. He was alive and buying fruit and playing with his son and whispering jokes to his wife while she pretended to be a widow who needed rescuing. But why? Why the elaborate lie? I wasn't rich. I hadn't been sending her huge amounts of money, just small amounts for groceries and school supplies. I hadn't proposed marriage or promised to bring her to America. What did she get out of this deception? My phone buzzed with a text message. Training was so boring. But learned some interesting techniques. How was your market adventure? Find anything good? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Found exactly what I was looking for. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, replaying every conversation we'd had, looking for clues I'd missed, lies I'd been too lonely or too stupid to catch. The way she'd never invited me to stay overnight. The way Leo seemed to know things about his father that a child who didn't remember would never know. The way her apartment felt staged, like a set, designed to tell a specific story. I'd been played. Completely, thoroughly played by a woman half my age who was probably laughing about it with her very much alive husband. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I didn't sleep for 2 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Clarice and Miguel and Leo, a perfect family unit that I'd never actually been part of. By Monday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed what little dignity I had left. I sent her a text. Can you talk? Need to discuss something important. My phone rang within minutes. Douglas? You sound strange in your message. Is everything okay? Her voice was concerned, caring. If I didn't know better, I'd think she was genuinely worried about me. I saw you, I said simply. At the market in Cubao, Saturday morning. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Clarice, you saw me? Her voice was different now, smaller. I don't understand. You were buying fruit, with a man and Leo. You were laughing and holding hands and looking very much like a family. Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. Douglas, I can explain. Please do. That was my cousin, Mario. He helps me with Leo sometimes, especially on weekends when I have to work. The words came out rushed, desperate. I didn't want to confuse you by introducing family complications. I thought it would be easier. Easier to lie? I didn't lie. Mario is family. He's been helping me since Miguel died. I should have told you about him, but I didn't want you to think there was another man in my life. Because there isn't. Not the way you mean. I closed my eyes and tried to picture the scene again. The easy intimacy between them. The way Leo had called the man Papa. The way Clarice had leaned into him like she belonged there. Your cousin, I repeated. Yes, my cousin. Douglas, you have to believe me. What we have is real. This thing between us is real. I would never lie to you about something that important. But she already had, hadn't she? From the very beginning, she'd been lying about something that important. Leo called him Papa. He's confused. He's only 6, and Mario has been the only father figure in his life since Miguel died. Children make mistakes about things like that. Do they? Douglas, please. Can we meet? Can we talk about this face to face? I can see you're upset, and I understand why, but this isn't what you think it is. I wanted to believe her. God, how badly I wanted to believe her. The alternative was accepting that I'd been a complete fool. That the first woman I'd felt anything for since Margaret's death had been manipulating me from day one. Okay, I heard myself saying. Tomorrow night, that cafe where we first had coffee. Thank you. The relief in her voice was palpable. Thank you for giving me a chance to explain. I promise everything will make sense. But after I hung up, I sat in my condo and realized that nothing she'd said actually made sense. If Mario was her cousin, why hadn't she mentioned him before? Why did she seem genuinely panicked when I told her I'd seen them? Why did a 6-year-old boy call his mother's cousin Papa? I thought about calling Mrs. Reyes, asking her what she knew about Filipino family dynamics. I thought about hiring a private investigator. I thought about packing up and flying back to Oregon, where the only lies I had to deal with were my own. Instead, I decided to give Clarice exactly what she'd asked for: one chance to tell me the truth. One opportunity to look me in the eye and explain away what I'd seen. Because, despite everything, despite the evidence and the inconsistencies and the voice in my head that sounded remarkably like Margaret telling me to wake up and pay attention, I was still hoping she could make it all make sense. I was still hoping that love, real love, could survive this. I should have known better. She was 30 minutes late. I sat in that same cafe near Tomas Morato, watching the door and checking my phone every few minutes while my coffee grew cold. Around me, couples talked and laughed and shared dessert, and I felt like an alien observing a species I'd never understand. When Clarice finally arrived, she looked different. Nervous. Her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something jittery and uncertain. She kept glancing around the cafe as if she expected someone to follow her. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Traffic was terrible." "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. We ordered coffee for me, tea for her, and sat in awkward silence until the server walked away. Then I looked directly at her and asked the question that had been eating me alive for 3 days. "Is he your husband?" She froze with her teacup halfway to her lips. "What?" "The man at the market. Mario. Your cousin. Is he actually your husband?" "Douglas, we talked about this on the phone," I explained. "You lied on the phone, just like you've been lying since the day we met. So I'm asking you again, and this time I want the truth. Is Miguel alive? Is he your husband?" Her hands were shaking now. She set down the teacup and pressed her palms flat against the table as if she needed to anchor herself to something solid. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Complicated how? He did leave, 2 years ago, just like I said. But he didn't die. We separated. He went to work in Saudi Arabia and sent no money, no letters, nothing. I thought he was gone forever." The cafe noise faded to background static. "But he came back. Last month. He lost his job overseas and had nowhere else to go. He said he wanted to try again, for Leo's sake. And you said yes. Leo needs his father, Douglas. I can't be selfish about this." "Selfish?" The word came out louder than I intended. An elderly couple at the next table looked over disapprovingly. "You let me fall in love with you while you were reconciling with your husband, and you're worried about being selfish? I never meant for this to happen. When I met you, Miguel was gone. I thought he was gone forever. What we had was real." "Was." She couldn't meet my eyes. "Is. What we have is real. But Miguel is Leo's father, and Leo has been asking for him every night for 2 years. How do I tell my son that I choose my own happiness over his need for a complete family?" I thought about all the money I'd given her over the weeks. All the groceries and school supplies and small gifts for Leo. All the plans I'd started making in my head about maybe, someday, bringing them both to Oregon. "So where does that leave me?" "I don't know." Her voice broke. "I wish I could choose you. I wish things were different. But I have to think about Leo first. You should have thought about Leo before you let me believe I was part of his life. You are part of his life. You've been so good to him, so patient and kind. He talks about you all the time. He calls Miguel Papa. That doesn't mean he doesn't care about you. But we both knew it meant exactly that. Leo was 6 years old and smart enough to know the difference between a father and a family friend. He'd made his choice clear at that market, swinging between his parents' hands while I stood invisible among the vegetable stalls. "Did any of it mean anything to you?" I asked. "The conversations, the time we spent together, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't paying attention? All of it meant something. That's what makes this so hard. But not hard enough to choose me." "No," she said simply. "Not hard enough to choose you." At least she was being honest now. Finally, brutally honest. I left 20 pesos on the table for my untouched coffee and stood up. "I hope you'll be happy." "Douglas." "Wait. No. I think we've said everything we need to say." I walked out of that cafe and into the humid Manila evening, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never see Clarice again, not the way I wanted to see her. Not as the woman I'd fallen in love with, but as the stranger who'd been playing house with my heart while her real family waited at home. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. The worst part was that I understood her choice. If I'd been in her position, if I'd had a child who needed his father, I probably would have made the same decision. But understanding something doesn't make it hurt any less. I didn't hear from Clarice for a week. 7 days of silence that stretched like years. I told myself it was over, that the conversation at the cafe had been our goodbye, but part of me kept waiting for my phone to ring. Part of me kept hoping she'd realize she'd made a mistake. Then, on a Thursday evening, while I was eating takeout and watching Filipino news I couldn't understand, she called, "Douglas, Clarice." My heart did something stupid and hopeful in my chest. "Can we meet? One more time? There are things I need to say." We met at a different cafe this time, one near her apartment. She looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of maintaining multiple lives had finally caught up with her. "Miguel and I are trying to work things out," she said without preamble. "For Leo's sake. I know, you told me, but I needed you to understand that what happened between us was real. I don't want you to think it was all lies." "Which part was real? The part where you told me your husband was dead? Or the part where you let me fall in love with you while he was sleeping in your bed?" "He wasn't sleeping in my bed. He's been staying with friends, only visiting Leo on weekends. We're taking things slowly." "How noble of you both." She flinched at my tone but pressed on. "I know you're angry. I know you have every right to be angry. But I need you to know that my feelings for you weren't fake. Your feelings for me don't matter if you choose him anyway. I'm not choosing him. I'm choosing Leo. It's the same thing." We sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd run out of ways to hurt each other. Around us, the cafe hummed with the conversations of people whose lives weren't falling apart in real time. "Will you be okay?" she asked finally. "I'm 67 years old. I've buried my wife and survived retirement and moved to a country where I don't speak the language. I think I can survive one more heartbreak." "I'm sorry, Douglas. I'm sorry for all of it. Are you? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" She considered the question longer than I expected. "Both, maybe. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I let it go on as long as I did. And yes, I'm sorry I got caught, because that forced us to have conversations neither of us wanted to have." At least, she was still being honest. I had to give her credit for that. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. Did you ever actually care about me? Or was I just a convenient source of grocery money while you waited for your husband to come home?" "I cared about you. I care about you. You made me feel like I was worth something more than just being Leo's mother and Miguel's wife. You listened to me talk about my work, my dreams, my fears. You treated me like an interesting person, not just a pretty face or a convenient body, but not interesting enough to choose. If I didn't have Leo, I would have chosen you. I want you to know that. But you do have Leo." "Yes, I do have Leo." I nodded and stood up. This time, I didn't leave money for coffee. This time, I didn't say goodbye. I just walked away. Outside, the Manila evening wrapped around me like a humid blanket. I walked aimlessly through streets I was just beginning to know, past vendors selling balut and teenagers playing basketball under streetlights and families gathered on plastic chairs outside their homes. I thought about Margaret, about how she used to say that love wasn't about finding someone you could live with, but finding someone you couldn't live without. I'd thought I couldn't live without Clarice, but I'd been wrong. What I couldn't live without was the idea of Clarice, the fantasy of being part of a ready-made family, the dream of not being alone anymore. The real Clarice, the woman who would always choose her son over any man, who would lie to protect her family's stability, who could love two men at once without apology, that woman I barely knew at all. And maybe that was my fault too. Maybe I'd been so desperate for connection that I'd fallen in love with a ghost of my own making. Either way, it was over now. Really, truly over. I just had to figure out how to live with that. For 3 days after that final conversation with Clarice, I didn't leave my condo. I ordered food delivery and ignored calls from my daughter back in Oregon and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, trying to recognize the man looking back at me. He looked older than 67. The Philippine sun had weathered his skin, but it was more than that. His eyes looked hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything behind them and left only the shell. His shoulders curved inward, as if he was trying to protect something that was already gone. This wasn't the man who'd taught 8th grade for 35 years. This wasn't the man who'd held his wife's hand through chemotherapy and radiation and the long nights when the morphine stopped working. This wasn't even the man who'd stepped off a plane in Manila 3 months ago, hoping to outrun his grief. This was someone I didn't recognize. Someone pathetic and gullible and desperate enough to believe that a beautiful woman half his age could actually fall in love with him. On the 4th day my phone rang. Not Clarice, I'd have recognized her number. This was a number I didn't know. Mr. Shaw, this is Daryl Peterson. I got your number from Mrs. Reyes. She said you might need some company. I'm sorry, who is this? American expat. Been living in Manila for 8 years. Mrs. Reyes thought maybe we could grab a beer, talk about home. She's worried about you. Mrs. Reyes. The elderly neighbor who'd warned me about beautiful women and foreign men. The one I'd dismissed as prejudiced and jealous. I appreciate the thought, but I'm not really up for company right now. Look, I don't know what happened, and I don't need to know. But I've been where you are. We've all been where you are. There's a poker game every Thursday night at my place. Nothing serious, just nickel and dime stuff. Good excuse to drink beer and complain about Filipino politics. I almost said no. Almost hung up and went back to staring at the stranger in my mirror. But something in Daryl's voice reminded me of the teachers I used to work with, practical, no-nonsense people who understood that sometimes you needed to be dragged back to life whether you wanted to go or not. What time? I heard myself asking. 7 o'clock. I'll text you the address. That Thursday, I found myself sitting around a folding table in Daryl's living room with 4 other American men, ages ranging from 50-something to 70-something, all of us nursing San Miguel beers and pretending to care about our cards. So you're the guy Mrs. Reyes has been worried about, said Pete, a retired Navy man from San Diego. She said you've been holed up in your place for a week. Something like that. Let me guess, said Tom, who'd introduced himself as a former engineer from Detroit. Fell for a local girl who turned out to be married? I looked up from my cards, surprised. It happens, said Mike, the youngest of the group at maybe 55. Happened to me my first year here. Happened to all of us at least once. Speak for yourself, laughed Daryl. I learned to spot the red flags early. But yeah, it's practically a rite of passage for American expats. The question is, what are you going to do now? I don't know, I said honestly. Go home maybe. This whole country feels poisoned now. Because of one woman? Pete shook his head. That's like saying you'll never eat again because one meal gave you food poisoning. It's not that simple. Sure it is. You made the classic mistake, fell in love with the idea of being rescued as much as you fell in love with her.